Welcome everyone to our webinar this morning, Legal Info versus Legal Advice. My name is Judy. I'm a staff lawyer at the Centre for Public Legal Education Alberta, or CPLE for short. Our goal is to make the law understandable for Albertans. We're a nonprofit organization serving all of Alberta, and we provide legal information and education through our various booklets, tip sheets, videos, webinars, websites, and more. And with me today, I have Natalie Tremblay, and Natalie is our education and design specialist at CPLE and the face behind our logo this morning. And Natalie will be monitoring the chat during the presentation and posting some things in there as we move through the content. So before we begin today, CPLE respectfully acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 4, 6, 7, 8, and 10 territories, the traditional lands of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. So a couple of housekeeping items. So first of all, we're not circulating slides of today's presentation. The information covered will be available in our tip sheets, which we will talk about later, and Natalie will post links as well in the chat. We are recording the presentation for internal purposes, and we may make the recording available at a later date. I ask that if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function, and we will save questions until the end. Another thing to keep in mind is that you will be prompted to complete a short survey when you exit the webinar. And of course, with this disclaimer here, this presentation contains legal info and is not intended to be legal advice. And funding for this webinar is provided by the Alberta Law Foundation and the Department of Justice Canada. So just to get a good feel of our audience here this morning, we're going to put up a poll here to see how familiar are you with the difference between legal info and advice. So if Natalie could bring that up right now. Okay, so see what the results are here. Okay, so the question is, what is your understanding of the difference between legal information and legal advice? Some of you know a little to nothing about the difference. Some of you say that comes out at work, but I'm not confident in this distinction. So that seems to be a good number of you, about 44%. Comes up at work. There are some of you that are comfortable with that distinction. Okay, that's really good to know as we move through the content today. All right. So some of you may be familiar with some of these examples, but let's say someone walks into your office or calls your organization and wants to share their story with you. Maybe their work visa has expired, they're experiencing family abuse and need to leave home, or they want to get a job, or they lost their job, or they're maybe dealing with an issue with government benefits, or they're facing criminal charges, or maybe they have some addiction issues. Well, oftentimes as part of a person's story, there are indications that there's potential legal problems to deal with. Maybe they have been just evicted, they lost a job, or their relationship ends. And these are perhaps situational indicators that there are likely legal problems. And maybe there are physical legal documents that they bring to you as well. So some examples of legal documents could be maybe filed court documents, maybe they have an appearance notice, maybe they have a letter from a lawyer, or maybe they're bringing a government or court form to you. And since we're on the subject of legal troubles here, what do you think are the top common legal problems that Canadians face? And if Natalie could bring that up here. Okay, so the top common legal problems that Canadians face. So there seems to be somewhat of a split amongst all of you here. Some of you think it's consumer debt and employment are some of the top problems. Others think that it's neighbors, human rights, and relationship breakdown. Have some answers for wills and incapacity and medical treatment issues, and some say housing and personal injury. Well, according to a 2016 report by the Canadian Forum on Civil Justice, the top 10 most common legal problems that Canadians face include all of what you've answered, actually. So it does include consumer debt, employment, neighbors, discrimination or human rights, family issues like relationship breakdown, wills and incapacity, medical treatment, housing, and personal injury. And to round out that list, the top three are actually consumer issues, debt issues, and employment issues. And these top issues on the list are also consistent with more recent research that's completed by Legal Aid BC. So, having said that, what do you say when you're faced with a client's story and they could potentially be dealing with legal problems that fall under all those different areas, or maybe some of them? So we acknowledge that many of you encounter similar situations all the time, and many of you have expertise in supporting individuals facing legal problems. And like we've seen a little bit earlier with the first poll, some of you are maybe just all new to this. And regardless of wherever you're starting from today, we hope that you learn a few takeaways from the webinar that can help you with your everyday work. Okay, so the crux of what we're dealing with today, we have two concepts: legal information and legal advice. So what's the difference? Right now, I'm showing them as two spheres, but as we continue discussing these concepts today, it sometimes gets a little bit fuzzy, and there is a gray line between the two. And this brings us to our next question. So why do we care about this distinction between legal info or legal advice? We'd say that when you end up giving legal advice, you can put your organization at risk, and you could also cause the client serious problems. And risk to organization could be reputational risks, potential legal liability. You could potentially face fines by the Law Society. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the risks to organizations in a case study a little bit later on. And of course, you can also cause the client serious problems if they do not get the legal help they need to actually solve their legal issues. So, for example, they can also end up incurring additional time, costs, and even emotional or psychological distress in dealing with their problems. So, when it comes to legal advice, really there's no definition of legal advice or legal info. And all we have is legislation governing legal professionals and the practice of law in Alberta, and case law or judge-made law. And the conclusion that we have come to is that legal advice is applying the law to a specific situation. And when we look at legislation in Alberta, only lawyers can give legal advice. And this, of course, differs according to jurisdiction. So we do note that in places like Ontario, for example, paralegals are licensed to give certain legal advice. And this point really brings us to our Legal Profession Act. So every province has similar legislation, but under Alberta's Legal Profession Act, Section 106, no person shall, unless the person is an active member of the society, practice as a barrister or solicitor. This also applies in situations about acting as a barrister or a solicitor in any court of civil or criminal jurisdiction, commencing, carrying, or defending any action or proceeding before a court or judge on behalf of another person, or settle or negotiate in any way for the settlement of any claim for loss or damage founded in tort. Okay, so what does it mean to actually practice as a solicitor? Really, there's no definition in the legislation I talked about. But when we look at the case law and referring to a case out of Ontario, a person who acts as a solicitor is one who conducts an action or other legal proceeding on behalf of another, advises that person on legal matters, frames documents intended to have legal operation, generally assists that other person in matters affecting this legal position. So from the legislation and case law, we could come up with the more practical definition of legal advice that really boils down to both actions and language. So practically speaking, for what we mean by actions, well, actions that can be considered giving legal advice include things like interpreting and applying the law, researching a legal issue, giving a legal opinion, recommending next steps, referring to maybe certain professionals, preparing legal documents, and representing someone. And we'll talk a little bit later about filling out forms, just as a bit of a precursor of what we'll cover later on. And like I mentioned before, there's also a component of language. And this is where language is very important. You have to think about perceptions. How is your answer going to be perceived by the person asking you questions, and what are their expectations? And language, we argue, that is indicative of giving legal advice includes such wording such as, in your case, you should, according to the law, you. In my opinion, a judge would say, you are right, I would recommend. You just need to fill out this court form. This document says that you should tell the judge, and what you are doing is legal or illegal. So now that we covered kind of like the language and actions of what we would consider giving legal advice, so what is legal information? Well, legal information is general information about the law and processes. And most of us are likely already operating in this realm of legal information. And this is an issue that's live here at CPLE as well. The organization itself creates and provides legal information. We do have 3 practicing lawyers on staff, but we do not give any legal advice to the public. So in terms of the actions, so what are actions that are in line with legal information? Well, we would say things like referring to resources, showing how to search, explaining what a law says, outlining possible options, explaining processes, defining common legal terms, and telling a person to get more help. And in contrast to, say, language of legal advice, language of legal information would be wording such as you might consider doing. I can tell you how the law generally works. Your options are, but you must decide what to do. You can find a lawyer by, you can find case law online at, you can go to this clinic for more help. You can try here to find more information about that type of problem. So now that I've gone over the distinction between legal info and advice and the actions and also the language that's involved, let's take it back to you. It's your turn. Let's take a moment to apply what you just learned. So what will happen is that a poll will pop up on screen asking you whether the situation involves giving legal info or advice. And the situations are adapted from the Law Society of Alberta's materials. You are welcome to explain why you chose your answer, I believe in the chat. And then I'll go over our take on whether the situation involves giving legal info or advice. So if Natalie could pull up the first question here. Okay, so some of you think this is the answer is legal information, and a good majority of you think this is legal advice. So the situation you're dealing with is you have a client that comes to you and says, I don't have any immigration status in Canada. I'm wondering if I can get financial help from the government. And the response is, no, you can't. If you don't have status here, you won't qualify. So our take on this is that we agree with the answer that this is considered legal advice. And really, it could be legal information if it just simply referenced that it depends on status. So, for example, if we change this around and said whether you can get financial help from the government depends on your immigration status, well, that would be more in line with giving legal information. But the answer, as it is right now, we believe it gives legal advice. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next example here. So you have a client that's on AISH, but just got a job 1 day a week. Tells you that the friend told them that they'll be cut off because they're working. And is their friend right? So what do you think about the answer? Okay, so some think it's legal information, but on the whole, most of you think this is legal advice. So we would agree with the answer that we also would consider this giving legal advice because of the wording. One way that how this could be legal information if you actually explain the AISH income threshold generally instead of making a conclusion about the client being able or being cut off from AISH. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next example here. So client goes to you, they say that they got hurt at work. Boss told them that they didn't have to make a claim, said should just take time off and get sick pay. Sounds easier to them. So what do you think about the answer of telling them that they need to apply for workers' compensation benefits and sick pay just won't be enough? Okay, so most of you do think this is legal advice, and we would agree with you. And really, if you were to give legal information, you could just explain when to apply for WCB and how sick benefits work generally, as opposed to applying the law to that certain situation, right? And making a declaration that the sick pay pay just won't be enough. Okay, so we have the next situation here. And what do you think about this? The client comes to you, tells you that their husband has been abusing them and they want to get a protection order, but they're afraid that you'll just get more upset and violent. And they ask you, what would you do? And you're explaining to them that there are many different types of protection orders court can make, and that orders one person have no contact with another person. And if you're unsure of the best option, you should talk to a lawyer. You could also contact the police for help getting an emergency protection order. So what do you think about this? Legal info or advice? Okay, so I do agree with most of you here. This is an example of legal information. The answer is general enough, and you're really explaining more of processes and also referring to the option to talk to a lawyer, or also being able to contact the police for more help. So we do think, certainly more indicative of giving legal information. Okay, and then the next situation here that we're going to pull up. So client finds out that the wife got no contact order. If I could just talk to her, no, we could work this out. I would never do anything to harm her. Should I call her? And you respond, it's possible that calling your wife would put you in breach of the court order. And if you do breach a court order, there could be consequences. You can speak to a lawyer for advice. So what do you all think about this? Legal info or legal advice? Yeah, so it's good. I think we're getting the hang of this. Yes, we do agree. This answer is providing legal information. I would also say that, the answer could be improved a little bit by not personalizing the answer to the situation. So for example, maybe using some language and wording saying that calling someone who has a contact order against you may put you in breach of the court order. So generalizing that answer would improve upon it. But overall, this answer is more in line with legal information. Okay, so we have another scenario here as well. Client's been charged with assault. I was drunk at the time and I have a drinking problem. If I get treatment, will I get released on bail? And you answer, it is possible that a judge will take that into consideration, but ultimately it is up to the judge. So is this legal information or legal advice? Okay, so most of you did answer legal information, but there are some answers thinking that this is legal advice. So we do agree with the answer that we do think this answer is providing legal information. You're acknowledging that it is a possibility that a judge will take the assault charge into consideration, but ultimately it is up to the judge. So you're not making like a conclusion or declaration of what a decision maker would potentially think about the case. So in our view, you're not applying the law to the situation. You're just kind of stating a possibility. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next one here. So a client says, can I travel with a criminal record? And you respond, it depends on what you were convicted of. If it was something like an impaired driving charge, it will be no problem. So what do you think? Is this legal information or legal advice? Okay, this is good. We're getting the hang of this. So yes, this is squarely legal advice. Really, like this answer could have been legal information if they just stopped after the first sentence, just saying it depends on what you were convicted of. And really, it could have been turned into legal information by referring to a lawyer and referring the person to travel guides, or simply saying, you don't know. So yes, the answer as it is right now, definitely legal advice. Okay, and then we're moving on to our next scenario here. I believe is the last one. Client comes to you and says, can I get a pardon now that cannabis is legal? And you respond, the government had announced they would implement a streamlined system for getting pardons for simple cannabis possession. So yes, you should get a pardon. So what do you think about this answer? Do you think it's legal info or legal advice? Okay, so in the most part, most of you do think this is giving legal advice, and I agree with you. Really, it would just be legal information if you stopped after the first sentence and not actually, make that that judgment at the end of saying, yes, you should get a pardon. Okay, so now that we've practiced a little bit of our knowledge about legal info or legal advice, let's get into some of the nuances here. What happens if you get those dreaded what if questions? So in your work, you may encounter maybe hypothetical questions or questions that you know are being asked to get a certain type of answer for a person's specific problem or problems. And you may be asked to answer a difficult question that you have no satisfying answer to. And sometimes a person is just asking you to listen to their need underneath the question, or they're particularly anxious about a problem they are dealing with. So if you're feeling brave in answering such questions, our tips for you would be that you can acknowledge the question, but try to address the underlying need without giving specific legal advice. So for example, this is something that's come up in my own work here at CPLE. This one time I was giving a tenancy presentation, and a participant kept on asking me a series of questions, of what if questions, about some issues that they were dealing with in a rental property. And they were asking things like, what if the landlord doesn't answer a tenant's calls when there's a concern? What if the landlord doesn't make certain repairs? What if there's a pest problem, but they're not dealing with it? And what happens if there were bed bugs before I moved in? And what if I don't pay rent? So my approach for dealing with, these series of bombarding questions really is to take a step back and think that all these questions actually pertain to questions about repairs on property. So how I worded this is that, there are steps that a tenant can take to deal with such situations, including contacting their local environmental public health office if a landlord is not making repairs and the rental property is maybe not meeting certain minimum housing and health standards. And we do have a number of resources covering this topic that you may want to refer to. So at the end of the day, you're dealing with these what if questions. I'd say, it's okay to say that I don't know, and refer the person to get further help. Okay, and another thing to be aware of is another tip we have is it's really important to be clear about what your role is and what you can and cannot do. And so here are some disclaimers that we use even in our own work to clarify that we could only provide legal information. So, if we're talking to someone, we say we cannot give you legal advice because I'm not qualified to, and this rule protects both me and you. Or if we're dealing with a written document, we have a disclaimer that says that the document contains legal information only. It does not provide legal advice. Okay, so a little bit of an elephant in the room here. Let's talk a little bit about forms. And I did mention this a little bit earlier on. Sometimes maybe someone comes to you and they want a form to be filled out. And whether it's a capacity issue, maybe it's a language issue, or they just don't know what the form is asking for, they just need your help. And oftentimes there are time constraints and they need help filling it out right away. So what do you do about situations like this? Well, filling out forms, this has actually been an issue that's addressed by a paper that was completed by Jennifer Bond, David Wiseman, and Emily Bates, and it's actually available on the Osgoode Hall Digital Commons. And in the paper itself, the authors explored the boundaries between providing legal information, legal advice, and legal services. And they actually used a case study involving a refugee settlement organization that got into a little bit of trouble. And they examined kind of the various challenges that the workers faced there, and when they were stepping into the world of providing highly regulated legal services. And like I mentioned before, one of the issues discussed was filling out forms. And what they came to the conclusion about is that drafting legal documents is considered a legal service restricted to lawyers, but there is uncertainty about filling out forms. Okay, and then it kind of like asks other questions as well. So what kind of assistance with forms is considered legal services? And if some of you were hoping for an answer today, I'm sorry to say that it's not really clear. And like I mentioned before, the paper was written in reference to a refugee settlement organization, the FCJ Refugee Center, a nonprofit organization based in Ontario. And they had been providing refugee support services to thousands of claimants for 20 years. And some of the support services that they got a little bit of trouble into included providing assistance with paperwork, translation and interpretation. They were accompanying people to hearings, and they were also making referral to immigration lawyers. And in 2012, the FCJ had received a cease and desist letter saying that its non-lawyer community legal workers were assisting refugee claimants with legal matters in a manner that was against the Law Society's regulations. And the scare from the Law Society's letter caused the FCJ to spend thousands of dollars on getting legal opinions and also consider closing its desperately needed programs. And like I mentioned before, at issue was also filling out forms, and what they were doing is workers were filling out something called a basis of claim form. And for those of you who are not familiar with what that is, well, the purpose of the basis of claim form is to present a person's refugee protection claim to the Refugee Protection Division. And like I mentioned before, unfortunately, the paper didn't have any straight answers about filling out forms, but it did identify other issues that are problems with filling out clients' forms. So, I mean, what happens if a client needs help understanding information in the form? Where in the form should a client record a particular fact? What is the meaning of challenging terminology in, like, say, non-native language, or English is not their first language? What if a client is not literate and needs help recording their narrative? So these are all kind of questions that remained at the end of this paper. So in practical terms, we're trying to make sense of this. And what are our tips? Well, first of all, like mentioned before, be aware that this is a very gray area of the law, and there are various opinions even across public legal education organizations or our counterparts in other provinces about how to deal with forms. And even within our own organization, we've had debates about this before. But we do say that there are some things that you really want to think about if you do have a regular practice of filling out forms. Like, what type of form is your client dealing with? Is it a form that helps them receive benefits? Are we talking about a court form? Is it a legal form? And is this a form that you can accurately and completely translate, interpret, or assist your client with? And if the client is able to tell their own story, these are all things that you should consider before filling out a form for someone else. And another tip we have is really talk to your boss. Is there an organization policy or practice for filling out forms? And at least in our organization, our tip would be, if a form may end up before a decision maker in a judicial setting, for example, a court, tribunal, commission, quasi-judicial tribunal, then we say, don't do it. And of course, there are maybe some narrow exceptions to this tip that there are situations where this doesn't make much sense. So for example, if your organization is a legal clinic or legal aid, and you provide legal services for people, well, then filling out forms is part of what you do. And this tip probably doesn't really apply to you that much. But if in doubt, when you're dealing with a filling out form type situation, you should be referring clients to other service providers to help them. So like I mentioned before, you can refer them to legal clinics, legal aid. There's also duty counsel at the courts. Or also you could help them, maybe refer them to a lawyer referral service to help them find a private lawyer. Okay, so what are the main takeaways for what I talked about today? So first of all, this goes back to the legal advice part. So applying the law specifically to your client is probably giving legal advice. And secondly, if you or your client is looking for legal information, there are lots of reliable sources of legal information out there, including CPLE. And the other point we want to bring up as well is that sometimes your client needs to talk to a lawyer. I know that many of you want to help people navigate through some of the most difficult challenges in their lives, and your organizations are providing valuable social services. But be aware that when it comes to legal problems, they're often quite complex, and really you should refer your clients to get legal advice. And lastly, like we already mentioned before, if you're ever in doubt about a situation, about whether you're getting legal advice or legal information, well, ask. Whether it's asking your boss or other coworkers about what you're doing is considered giving legal advice or information. Get the conversation started. And if you don't have an organization policy or best practices already in place to deal with these types of problems, well, maybe it's time for you to consider establishing one. And so everything that we've covered today in this webinar, these are the tip sheets that I referred to a little bit earlier on, and Natalie will be posting links in the chat. But legal information, legal advice, is it reliable? 7 steps to solving a legal problem. All of these tip sheets are available on our publications page. And we also have videos available as well on our YouTube page covering these topics. Mentioned before, for those of you who are not familiar with CPLE, all our publications and resources are available on our website. You could order print publications. You could also search all of our websites for more information as well. And this is our website for those of you who are not familiar with it. Okay, we're just gonna pop this back into our PowerPoint here. Okay. And as for upcoming webinars, our organization is always creating new types of resources and creating opportunities for people to learn more about the law. So in the next little while, we do have 3 upcoming webinars that you might be interested in. First one's Planning for the Future, Adult Guardianship and Trusteeship Act. That's coming up very quickly next week. And we will be having some members of the private bar attend that webinar, and also chipping in with their insight on this topic. And of course, Renting 101, that will be on March 16th, and that will be a panel type discussion with a lawyer from the Edmonton Community Legal Center, as well as we also have a representative from Service Alberta attending on that webinar as well. And then of course we have a family law update coming up in April. So lastly, we do appreciate any feedback on our webinars, and especially this webinar today. So if you could take some time to quickly fill out a feedback form on SurveyMonkey, that will be greatly appreciated. And just take a moment here now to answer any questions that you might have about today's material. If you could just please use the Q&A function, that will be great. Okay, so it seems like we do have some questions. First one here is about helping someone with POA documents. So I'm assuming that the acronym is referring to power of attorney documents. This would go back to my original point here, is that, we're talking about also, are you assisting someone from the capacity of, say, being a lawyer? And if not, I think that with power of attorney documents, this would definitely be something that would refer to a lawyer about. That answers your question. Okay. Can a paralegal in Alberta prepare a will? Not to my knowledge. I mean, if a paralegal, perhaps under the supervision of a lawyer, I could maybe see that as a potential possibility. But other than that, this would fall into something that a lawyer would be doing. Okay, so I think we might have. Okay, so how about if someone who cannot afford a lawyer? Okay, so depending on where the person is, like I did mention before, there are actually legal clinics throughout the province, and they do help people who meet certain income thresholds with their legal problems. So depending on where the person is located, we could certainly maybe provide a link to where they could find further legal help as well. So we also do have a list of legal clinics, I believe, available or resources that they could refer to on our website. If you could take a look there. Difficult in rural communities to access. Okay, so maybe the question has to do with what if the person is in a rural community. Really, I'm not too sure exactly where this person would be located, but from what I understand, with some of the existing legal clinics that are out there, there is some good coverage across the province, so you might want to check with whatever is closest to them. And in the alternative, could also call a lawyer referral service. They could provide the names of up to 3 lawyers that practice in that area of law that they're dealing with, and perhaps even within the geographical region that they're located in. Okay, so if there aren't any further questions, then I hope you do join us in future webinars. And if there's anything that pops up a little bit later on after this webinar, you can feel free to email us at info@cple.ca. Always glad to refer to other organizations and resources that could help you and your client. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining. Bye.